Well, Iran's attack on Israel brought a decades-long proxy war to the brink of a red-hot conflict. But most experts in the West agreed with President Biden's verdict that it was an emphatic Israeli win. Iran looked weak, Israel looked strong again. Western allies and key Arab states rallied to Israel's defence, underscoring ties that have been sorely tested by Israel's assault on Gaza. My next guest often swims against the tide of expert consensus. He's previously argued that a nuclear Iran would make the world a safer place and that Israel is the Middle East's foremost agitator. Returning to Uncensored, delighted to welcome back Professor John Mershaymer. Well, John, great to have you back on. First of all, your reaction to what happened when Iran attacked Israel.
Well, I was actually quite amazed that the Iranians attacked Israel. I mean, this was the first case of Iran launching missiles from its own territory and hitting Israel. And they launched a massive attack. And even though the vast majority of those missiles and drones did not get through, the fact is that they did launch this attack and some got through. And then the Israeli retaliation was actually a very small retaliation. It's quite amazing to me how minor the retaliation was. And if you look at what the consequences of this are, I think it is not good for Israeli deterrence moving forward. The Israelis care greatly about deterrence, and for deterrence to matter or to work for them, what's necessary is for Israel to have escalation dominance. If Iran and Israel get into a fight, it's essential for Israel that it dominate as the two sides go up the escalation ladder. That's what produces deterrence. But if you look at what happened in this case, there was no escalation dominance. The Iranian attack was much larger than the Israeli attack.
Well, it was, but I would counter by saying that the Iran attack was a spectacular failure in the sense that it caused almost no damage. Almost all the missiles were taken out by the Iron Dome. And actually, I would say most significantly of the whole thing was the way that neighbouring Arab countries like Jordan raced to help defend Israel. Even Saudi Arabia allowed some of its airspace to be used. We saw the UK, we saw the French and others come in as well. So there was an immediate and rapid collaborative defence of Israel against Iran's missile attack, which thwarted any real damage being done. And in their counter, Israel, you could argue, were very specifically targeted around some of the nuclear plants which Iran is believed to have, that they were making the point that they could target anywhere in Iran at will and land their missiles, as opposed to them being taken out by any kind of Iron Dome defence. So I would take issue with your categorisation that this was somehow a victory for Iran in here. I think that what Israel did was make a very clear statement. If you want to do this, we have the capacity to strike anywhere in Iran at will, and we also have the backing of a lot of neighbouring countries.
There was never any question that Israel had the capability to hit Iran with huge numbers of missiles and aircraft. That was never in doubt. But the fact is their retaliation involved attacking one radar. They didn't, in a sense, turn the dogs loose and really hit Iran with large numbers of missiles and rockets.
Smart? Isn't that smart? I mean, I urged, and like many people, including President Biden, I urged in a post to X that I really hope Israel shows some restraint here, but I fear that Netanyahu wouldn't. And to my pleasant surprise, on this occasion, he did show some restraint. Because I think that there's a lot of goading going on. Well, if I finish my point, I think there's a lot of goading going on right across the region against Israel. Well, let me finish my point, then I'll get your response. You know, when you see the activity of Hezbollah, of the Houthis, of what Hamas did on October the 7th, and what Iran then did in response to the attack on their consulate, there's a lot of deliberate provocation, I think, of Israel to try and goad them into an overreaction, which may then ruin their global support and sympathy. I mean, I would argue that that is at least a possibility, isn't it?
Well, first of all, it was the Israelis who started this by bombing the Iranian embassy in Damascus. The Iranians did not start this conflict that recently took place between April 1st and April 19th.
But they were there with people from Hezbollah, weren't they? So they were military leaders using the consulate to plan attacks on Israel with leaders of Hezbollah. I mean, that was why they were targeted.
Look, in international law and according to international norms, states don't attack the embassies of other states. This was considered to be a significant provocation.
Unless they're being used they're being used as military bases, which it is believed, certainly Israel argues. No. I don't know, but it's certainly been argued by Israel that it was being used, part of this consular area was being used as a genuine military base, in which case it becomes a legitimate target if indeed they are meeting with Hezbollah to plan attacks on Israel, isn't it?
There's no evidence that it was being used as a military base. And the fact is that if the Israelis are going to hit the Iranian embassy, the end result is the Iranians are going to retaliate. And they did retaliate. Now, I want to say a few words about that retaliation. It's very important to understand that the Americans and the Iranians orchestrated the Iranian attack so that it would be a limited attack. It would do very little damage to Israel. And the reason this is the case is that neither the Iranians or the United States wanted this conflict. And it was the Israelis who, by attacking the Iranian embassy in Damascus, dragged the Americans and the Iranians into this conflict. And what we tried to do, working with the Iranians before the attack on April 14th and during the attack on April 14th, was to do everything possible to keep it limited and avoid escalation.
The whole issue of nuclear weapons here, interesting that you believe that if Iran was allowed to arm itself with nuclear weapons, it would make the world a safer place. Just explain why you believe that.
Well, first of all, I think from an American point of view, and certainly from an Israeli point of view, it would be all for the good if Iran did not get nuclear weapons. I think from Iran's point of view, it makes sense to have a nuclear deterrent because nuclear weapons are the ultimate deterrent. So I want to discriminate or distinguish between what I think is the American and Israeli perspective on one hand and what the Iranian perspective is on the other hand.
Well, what is your perspective?
Now, with regard
personally
to the question of my perspective as an American is I hope that Iran does not get nuclear weapons. And in fact, I think that Israel made a major mistake precipitating this recent conflict because it increases the likelihood that Iran will get nuclear weapons, which is not in Israel's interest. So I want to be very clear. I'm not in favor of Iran getting nuclear weapons.
So why would you think, just on that point, just to jump in, why would you then think the world's a safer place if you personally do not think they should be given nuclear weapons? Wouldn't it actually have the opposite effect, that if you have a regime like the one in Iran right now, the world is likely to be a far more dangerous place if they have the capacity for a nuclear attack?
No, because nuclear weapons are weapons of mass destruction. And that would make the Israelis and the Americans incredibly wary of attacking Iran, a nuclear-armed Iran, for fear that Iran would use its nuclear weapons either against us or against the Israelis. There's no question, if you go back and look at the Cold War, the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union both had nuclear weapons made the likelihood of conflict between the superpowers much less likely, because again, these are weapons of mass destruction. So if Iran had nuclear weapons, Israel had nuclear weapons, and the United States had nuclear weapons, all three countries would be remarkably cautious in terms of approaching each other with military forces. If you have a Middle East where nobody has nuclear weapons, you can think about fighting a conventional war. And conventional war is much less deadly, for obvious reasons, than nuclear war. So the argument here is that nuclear weapons are basically a force for peace. This is not to say you could never have a nuclear war if Iran had nuclear weapons. And that, of course, is why you don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. But it is much less likely that you would have a war between Iran and Israel or Iran and the United States if Iran had nuclear weapons.